There's a question most of us don't talk about openly, even though it affects millions of people across different stages of life. What happens to a person when they go without intimate physical connection for an extended period? Not by choice for spiritual reasons, not temporarily, but when circumstances, psychology, or life itself creates a prolonged absence of this fundamental human experience. We live in a culture that simultaneously obsesses over intimacy and avoids honest discussion about it. We're caught between extremes, either treating it as trivial entertainment or moralizing it into silence. But Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, approached this question differently. He saw intimate connection not as a mere biological urge, but as a fundamental psychic force that shapes our entire inner world. Today, we're going to explore what Jung understood about prolonged abstinence, what happens in the psyche when this energy has nowhere to go, and why this matters for understanding ourselves. Before we can understand what happens during prolonged abstinence, we need to understand what Jung meant by this energy. Unlike Freud, who saw libido as primarily a physical drive, Jung expanded this concept. For Jung, libido was psychic energy itself, the fundamental life force that powers all human activity, creativity, relationships, and growth. Physical intimacy is one manifestation of this energy, but not the only one. Jung believed this energy could be channeled, transformed, and redirected into other areas of life. This process, which he called sublimation, explains how artists, scientists, and mystics throughout history have poured tremendous energy into their work. But here's the critical point. Transformation requires consciousness and intention. When libido is simply blocked without redirection, when it's repressed rather than transformed, Jung believed it doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere else, into the unconscious, where it begins to operate autonomously, outside our awareness and control. Jung observed that when powerful instincts are denied expression without conscious integration, they don't vanish. They sink into what he called the shadow, the part of our psyche containing everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The shadow grows stronger when fed by repression. Energy that cannot find natural expression begins to manifest in indirect ways. Jung documented several patterns in his clinical work. Some people become irritable, anxious, or depressed without understanding why. Others develop obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors. The energy seeks outlet wherever it can find one. Jung noted that some individuals channel this energy into creative or intellectual pursuits and genuinely thrive. But this requires self-awareness. It requires knowing what you're doing and why. For most people, especially those who aren't deliberately choosing abstinence as part of a spiritual or personal practice, the blocked energy simply creates psychological pressure. Think of it like a river that's been dammed. The water doesn't disappear. It either finds another route, builds up pressure, or floods the surrounding landscape. Psychic energy operates similarly. Jung understood that psyche and body are not separate. What happens in the mind affects the body, and what happens in the body affects the mind. Prolonged periods without physical intimacy don't just create psychological effects, they create physiological ones. Modern research has confirmed some of what Jung intuited. Extended periods without this form of connection can affect hormone levels, sleep patterns, immune function, and stress responses. The body evolved with certain expectations about the rhythms of life, and when those rhythms are disrupted, the system responds. But Jung was more interested in the psychological manifestations. He observed that people experiencing prolonged abstinence often reported difficulty concentrating, increased emotional volatility, and a sense of being disconnected from their own bodies. Some described feeling as though they were living entirely in their heads, cut off from instinct and feeling. This disconnection is significant. Jung believed that wholeness, what he called individuation, requires integrating all aspects of ourselves: mind and body, consciousness and instinct, spirit and flesh. When we deny one aspect, we fragment ourselves. Here's where Jung's insights become particularly relevant. When this energy is repressed over long periods, it doesn't remain neutral. It becomes autonomous. It begins to operate independently in the unconscious, influencing behavior in ways we don't recognize. Jung called these autonomous complexes. They're like subpersonalities within us that have their own agendas. A repressed intimate complex might manifest as sudden, inexplicable attractions, inappropriate behavior, or even projections onto others, where we see our denied desires reflected in the world around us. This is why Jung was skeptical of purely moral approaches to human drives. Simply saying no to an instinct without understanding it, without integrating it into consciousness, doesn't resolve anything. It just pushes the problem underground, where it becomes more powerful and less controllable. The shadow doesn't play by conscious rules. It operates through slips, mistakes, dreams, and sudden impulses. People who pride themselves on perfect control often find themselves blindsided by the very things they've repressed. Jung made an important distinction between chosen and unchosen abstinence. When someone consciously decides to abstain from physical intimacy as part of a spiritual practice or personal discipline, they're engaging in active transformation of energy. Monks, mystics, and spiritual practitioners throughout history have done this successfully. The key is consciousness. These individuals aren't repressing their drives, they're sublimating them. They're consciously redirecting that energy toward meditation, prayer, service, or creative work. There's awareness, intention, and a framework that gives meaning to the sacrifice. But even Jung acknowledged, this path is difficult and not for everyone. It requires exceptional self-awareness and often a supportive community or tradition. For most people living ordinary lives, attempting this without proper understanding or support simply creates problems. The difference between sublimation and repression is the difference between choosing to redirect a river and trying to pretend the river doesn't exist. We live in a time of strange contradictions. We're more saturated with imagery and content than ever, yet many people report feeling more disconnected than previous generations. Loneliness is epidemic. Many go months or years without intimate contact. Jung would likely see this as a cultural shadow problem. When intimacy becomes either commodified entertainment or moralistic taboo, we lose touch with it as a natural human function, connected to vulnerability and relationship. We end up with stimulation without satisfaction, arousal without connection. The psychological effects Jung described, anxiety, depression, disconnection, irritability, are widespread in modern society. Of course, prolonged abstinence isn't the only cause, but Jung would argue it's one factor among many contributing to our collective psychological distress. Modern psychology recognizes that healthy, intimate expression, within whatever form works for an individual, contributes to overall well-being. This doesn't mean everyone needs to be physically active all the time, but it does mean acknowledging these drives as a legitimate aspect of human nature. Jung never prescribed one path for everyone. He believed in individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, which looks different for each person. Some people genuinely thrive with minimal physical connection. Others need regular intimate relationships to feel balanced. Most of us fall somewhere in between. The question isn't whether prolonged abstinence is objectively good or bad. The question is, what's true for you? Are you consciously choosing this, or is it happening by default? If it's by default, what's preventing you from seeking intimacy and connection? Fear, past trauma, social anxiety, circumstances. Jung would encourage honest self-examination. What are you telling yourself about why you're abstinent? Is that story serving you or protecting you from something you need to face? Is the energy finding healthy expression elsewhere in your life? Or is it creating pressure and problems? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're important ones. Self-knowledge requires uncomfortable honesty. Jung's ultimate message about human drives, as with all instincts, was about integration. The goal isn't to transcend your nature or conquer it or deny it. The goal is to understand it, accept it as part of who you are, and find appropriate expression for it in your life. For some, this means intimate relationships. For others, it means creative sublimation. For many, it means some combination. But whatever path you choose, it needs to be conscious. It needs to be your choice, made with awareness of what you're doing and why. The shadow only has power when we refuse to look at it. When we bring things into consciousness, when we acknowledge them, they lose their autonomous grip on us. We can then decide how to relate to them. Jung believed psychological health requires accepting the totality of who we are, light and dark, spiritual and instinctual. We don't have to act on every impulse, but we do have to acknowledge them as part of ourselves. So what happens if you don't do it for too long? Jung's answer is nuanced. It depends on who you are, why you're abstinent, and what you're doing with that energy. There's no universal timeline, no point at which something definitively breaks or changes. But Jung was clear about this. Denying fundamental aspects of human nature without conscious transformation creates psychological problems. Energy that cannot flow forward flows backward into the unconscious. What we refuse to face doesn't disappear, it gains power. Perhaps the real question isn't about duration at all. Perhaps it's about honesty. Are you being honest with yourself about what you need, what you fear, and what you're avoiding? That's the question Jung would ask. The psyche seeks wholeness, always. When we fragment ourselves, when we deny parts of who we are, the psyche will find ways to signal that something is wrong. Symptoms, dreams, slips, and suffering are all messages from the unconscious parts of ourselves trying to be recognized. Listen to those messages. That's where the work begins.